Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us for the third session of Inter-Archives Conversations. I hope that you all are keeping well and taking good care of yourselves. I'm Sneha Raghavan. I'm Senior Researcher and Projects Lead at Asia Art Archive in India, and I'm based in New Delhi. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, Asia Art Archive is an independent nonprofit organization that was set up in the year 2000 in response to the urgent need to document and make accessible recent histories of art in the region. AA's main office is in Hong Kong, where we have a reference library with a growing collection of books, catalogs, periodicals, and zines from across Asia. Our archival materials are digitized and made accessible online through our website, and we also organize programs, exhibitions, and publications. Asia Art Archive in India's office is based in New Delhi, where we also have a small reference library and provide access to our on-site digital collections. It is open to visitors by appointment, so if you do find yourself in Delhi next time, do write to us and drop by. Now, one of the projects that we've been working on over the last nearly 2 years across Delhi, Hong Kong, and Kathmandu is Mobile Library Nepal. This is a collaboration between Asia Art Archive and the Siddhartha Arts Foundation. And it is a traveling library which circulates books on recent art from Asia within Nepal. It was officially launched in February this year with the generous support of the Foundation for Arts Initiatives. Through a series of on-site and online programs with educators, artists, universities, and independent arts organizations, the site of the library is being activated since its launch, and it is currently situated at Kalo 101 in Patan in Nepal. Now, before we move into the specifics of today's program, I'd first like to invite Asia Art Archive's new Executive Director, Christopher Kehoe, to say a few words. Chris.
Thank you so much, Sneha, for that introduction to Asia Art Archive and me. And thank you to the listeners who are joining us today or tonight from Nepal, India, Pakistan, other parts of South Asia, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. So my name is Christopher Ho, and I am the new Executive Director of Asia Art Archive. And I am particularly pleased to have the opportunity to welcome you this evening as the community building that underpins the Inter-Archives Conversation series is essential to Asia Art Archive in India, in Hong Kong, and in America. As the name Asia Art Archive implies, our mission, as Sneha briefed you, since our founding over 20 years ago, is to identify, digitize, and make publicly accessible materials from and around recent art in Asia. It is also to question, in collaboration and in dialogue with peers, like the ones you'll hear from tonight, the possibilities, persuasions, and power of archives. How do archives guide the stories we tell each other and to ourselves? How might these stories recursively fold back and inform the structure and content of past and future archives? Can storytelling itself be a form of active archiving? Which stories are obscured and which resound? Tonight, as we listen to various responses to these and many other questions, you will hear the distinct grain of our distinguished panelists' voices. Diwas Raja KC, Sophia Balagamwala, and ASM Rizar Rahman hail from diverse and different initiatives. Co-organizer of this panel, Nepal Picture Library, Citizens Archive of Pakistan, and Drick Picture Library. They bear witness to the complexity of and contradictions in each archive, and collectively to the vast potentials of archiving. So a very warm welcome to our speakers and to you, our listeners, for joining. I will now pass the floor back to Sneha.
Thank you, Chris. On to our session now. And please bear with me for the longish introduction. Now, one of the crucial areas that the programs at Mobile Library Nepal have been reflecting on is archiving. The growing interest in the practice of archiving, as well as archival initiatives that have emerged in recent times in the region. So with inter-archives conversations, the idea is to have a platform for institutions and individuals working with archives in the region to come together and share about the forms and infrastructures of their archives, how they think about their work, and situate the materials in context of the urgencies of the present. So for us, Nepal becomes a point of departure and South Asia a context to hold these conversations, not in the strictest sense of a geopolitical region, but rather as a way to think about certain shared affinities and histories to ground our concerns. So how can we share our materials and our processes with each other? How can we learn from each other? And also perhaps ask each other some critical questions. Now, inter-archives conversations are conceived as a series of 4 conversations spread over a year in conjunction with Mobile Library Nepal, and each conversation is conceptualized in collaboration with an archive in Nepal based on the key concerns and interests of the archive in question. Now, as we know, an archive, any archive, is hardly ever able to present itself to us in its entirety, in one glimpse, as it were. There are always infrastructures, perhaps lines of inquiry, or narratives through which we encounter the archive. And without these, the archive would come across as a seemingly abstract, perhaps even a unidimensional and a homogeneous entity. So it is really through these narratives of and from the archive that the documents and the stories emerging from them, the people working at the back end of the archive, or even the urgencies that led to the collection of such materials come alive. So these narratives are presented to us in many ways. They take the form of writing, of exhibitions, publications, artistic interventions, collaborations, citations, and much more. And with digital tools and media, this is taken to another level as it is. And so today's conversation, which we have organized in collaboration with Nepal Picture Library, focuses on the act of creating narratives of and from archives with a specific focus on the urgencies of citizens' archives. And given that, the question of who gets to be identified as a citizen and who doesn't continues to be a burning sort of political issue in South Asia and globally, really, how does this get articulated via the archive is also something maybe we're hoping to explore. Now, I want to read here a line from Nepal Picture Library, who are our co-organizers for today's session, and their description of their work. They say, and I quote, "The archive serves as a safe and open repository for materials that can secure a multicultural and pluralist representation of Nepali history. The archive functions as a medium for active public engagement through which Nepali people can deepen meaningful connections with the past," close quotes. And so archives do at least 2 things. One, they perform a representative function. A citizen's archive, for instance, may represent a nation's history, perhaps, but what kind of history is that? For whom is it? Where is it coming from, right? And second, archives perform a mediating function. They narrativize, they activate, they seek engagement for all the documents and all the presences that are there within the archive. So with this, I welcome our speakers for today. We have Divas Raja Kesi, who is Head of Research and Archives at Nepal Picture Library in Kathmandu. We have Sophia Balagamwala, who is an artist curator and at present the advisor to the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. And we have ASM Razaur Rahman, who is the curator and general manager of DRIC Bangladesh, as well as executive director of Chobi Mela. Now, more detailed biographies of our speakers can be found on the programs page on our website. And I want to thank all of them for accepting our invitation to speak today. Now, before I invite Divas to make his presentation, some quick housekeeping. This session will be for 1.5 hours. The speakers will be presenting their work in the first 45 minutes, and then we will have a conversation and open it up, to questions from audiences. Now, if you have questions, please type them in Zoom's Q&A feature, and you can do this at any point of time during the talk or after, and we will do our best to take them up in the discussion. So without further ado, I now hand it over to Divas. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Sneha, for that wonderful introduction. I've also realized that, since the conversation we had, I've taken a slightly different tack with my presentation today. I guess I'm occupied with some other concerns that will sort of reveal themselves through the presentation. But yeah, I mean, I want to open by thanking the Asia Art Archive team, as well as the Mobile Library Nepal for organizing this special event. And on behalf of Nepal Picture Library, I'm delighted to be participating in the dialogue today. In my view, I should share my screen first, in my view. Oopsie. I might need help now. It's not my slideshow. The screen's not coming up. Yeah, thank you so much, Samira. Yeah, in my view, this whole series of inter-archives conversations is a vital endeavor. It's providing a ground where both the archive as a professional practice with a special set of questions and dilemmas, as well as the archive as a concept, or let's say a loose metaphor, that both can be held together. The archive, of course, no longer refers to a stable storage of information-bearing materials, but has itself become the world, has itself become sort of like a word to denote certain anxieties about living in this very hyper-mediated societies that's based on information overflow. Next slide, Samira. I hope my own talk today will be received in the spirit captured in the series title Inter-Archives, that perhaps pressures us to recognize that if archives are to preserve their role in today's information landscape, it is imperative that archives take seriously the conditions of collaboration, participation, and proliferation. I wanted to specifically thank Sneha and Samira for not only being ideal interlocutors during the planning for today's talk, but also because the questions that Samira sent out about the relation between the archive and the narrative form, about the not at all straightforward connection between archives and publics, will be the spur for my reflections today. Next slide. Since I have been given the prerogative to use my slot to make propositions in lieu of a presentation on Nepal Picture Library, I'm going to take it up in order to hopefully open up the conversation further. And I will be speaking in a somewhat speculative vein through a series of semi-formed thoughts. And this will reflect both where my headspace has been through this very confusing year, and also hopefully inklings about which directions I think conversations about archives and media practices need to go. Samira asked about the forms in which the archives exist as well as circulate, forms that range for Nepal Picture Library from publications, exhibitions to digital databases. While ordinarily I might have answered Samira's questions about the narrative outputs of archives in the affirmative, much of which Sneha covered in the introduction as well. That is, yes, narrative is key to how we seek to challenge dominant histories. Today, I think I want to say that this relation between archives and narrations is no longer straightforward. It is fair to assume, of course, that citizen-based archives have a close relation to counter-narrative strategies. Next slide, Samira. We justify our very existence as an archive on the recognition of gaps in our national narratives, that silences are inherent in the writing of history as well as the creation of archives. We exist because we believe that the problem of archival silence isn't simply a matter of evidence gathering. Instead, we underscore that records have other contextualities that can be revealed only through new archival methods. And photographs are a very good example of this. Our counter-narrative strategies are also registered in two primary ways in which we present our archives, which we claim will either fill in the gaps or disrupt the foundational narrative that nation states need to justify their own existence. And I'm hoping Sophia and Reza will speak more on this aspect. For my part, I wanted to take the question of narrativity slightly elsewhere. So when we talk about the archive, we generally understand it to mean the content of the archive. That is different types of records and collections, like it would mean for us who is in the photograph, what is happening in the photograph, and so on. But implicit in Samira's question is also the issue of form. Can you go to the next slide, Samira? For reasons perhaps obvious, the form I think that needs our attention is the digital platform. Perhaps it's the intensified digitization of our lives that has happened over the last 2 years, or perhaps it's because at Nepal Picture Library, we are currently working hard to move all our collections to an online database. But the question of how the digital media is reconfiguring the very processes of remembering and forgetting has been kind of occupying me. Of course, Nepal Picture Library owes its very existence to digitality. How could we exist if digital technology had not freed the parameters for archival storage through upload and download functions, assisted by what we unironically call the computer's random access memory? The fact that we have designated ourselves archivists without any training in information or library sciences has a lot to do with how digital technology has loosened the hold sovereign powers and states have over the way societies organize collective memory today. So NPL's primary work, next slide, is digitization, that is remediating analog photographs as digital photographs. The theoretical foundation for digitization is the radical democratization of memory. The principle of digitization drives nearly all archives today because it promises to solve the problem of space and site specificity as pressures from outside, not least the various redresses for archival silences that we've been talking about, of which all citizen archives are essential efforts, exhort ever more materials of every type and format to be preserved as valuable to public life and collective memory. That is a capacity impossible without digital technology. Digitization assists quick search and instant availability of memory objects to anyone from anywhere in the world. So compression, resolution, software upgrade, synchronization, compatibility, flow, transfer. These are the concepts with which digital societies seek their memorization and self-image, with ever-intensifying pressure for archives to function within the stream of constant communication and connectivity. Save everything. That is the new archival imperative. Next slide. The important thing about a digital archive is its mathematical algorithmic structure, which is to say, even as we turn to the digital to enable our counter-narrative strategies, the digital form itself is radically divorced from narrativity. Wolfgang Ernst would be very instructive here, who says, whereas the 19th and 20th century archives were dependent on the meaning and narrative coherence of textual print media, and the profession of history likewise relied on close reading and textual interpretation, these literary and narrative tools do not have an essential link to the computer processes behind digital archives, for which the only thing that matters is that an object can be turned into information as transmittable bytes of data. The data structure of digital archives favor navigation of vast troves of materials that can be connected through information nodes you can input, rather than narrative building from careful reading of limited records. And their algorithmic power facilitates free associative and discontinuous search and retrieval rather than semantic research. When you think about it, actually, much of the counter-narrative projects we have done at Nepal Picture Library, from Dalit A Quest for Dignity to the Feminist Memory Project, have heavily relied on this associative and similarity-based retrieval keyword searches, and other mathematical capacities of the computer, to read the archives in ways that can challenge specific silences of the archives. Next slide. The relation between archive, memory, and narrative, which is what I'm trying to say, cannot be taken for granted in the digital platform. And this has huge consequences for how digital archives conceive themselves and what kind of uses these archives prepare themselves for. I think it is important to point out the strong correlation and overlap between the imperative of hyper-connected digital media and the ostensible objectives of citizen archives like ours. Next slide. There's a Canadian archivist called Terry Cook, who has this wonderful essay titled, "We Are What We Keep What We Are," where he lays out the history of archival thinking as 4 evolutionary stages of archival policy. In the final and current phase of the archive, he says, the archives seek to engage citizens directly. Citizens, broadly defined, become not only participants, but also the keepers of the archives. And archivists relate to citizens through a blend of coaching, partnership, and collaborating. These archives, based on broad participation of citizens, are made technologically possible by digital media. Various communities today initiate their own community archives, seeking to gain control over their own narratives and representation. And even for those who aren't doing so, the quest for archival dignity has exploded. And this can be witnessed in the multifarious ways and unexpected places where the concept of the archive is mobilized today. And much of these civic processes of developing archival consciousness and broadening archival heritage flourish in the internet and social networking. The growth of citizen archives, oral history projects, community archives, visual repositories constitute a new ecology of memory, of which we see ourselves a part of. Memory has broken free, so to speak, from the institutional and classificatory regimes that organize the nation's memory or collective memory. It is increasingly impractical to persist with the concept of the archive as stewardship over specific repositories and collections. As Terry Cook suggests in the quote displayed, both because the communities of memory are constituting themselves in radically new ways, and because the very material context of the digital milieu has changed what memory is and what memory does, archives desperately need new theories and approaches. So my own preoccupation with the digital, as I have been displaying, probably has to do with the fact that Nepal Picture Library has been working on our ambitious new website to house all our collections. And next slide, Samira. And designing the new interface, it dawns on you where one's archival identity colludes or collides with the digital interface culture. Interface, of course, is where the machinic, non-human computational operations interact with the visual, oral, and the tactile dimensions of human sense perception. So on our digital interface, we are constantly trying to create descriptions for semantic narrative meaning making of our records, but also at the same time, we have to create connective nodes, links and pathways that encourage bypassing descriptions altogether. And so it appears to us as a kind of a contradiction, when we move to the digital platform.
Divas, sorry to interrupt, you have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So digitality fosters new values: availability, accessibility, unchecked commentary, open access, right to know, instantaneous search, immediate retrieval, user friendliness, and easy help functions, flexibility for mobile device users. So these aesthetic and functional pulls of data mining, commercial search engines like Google, or for us, the stock archive of Getty Images, loom heavily over our own sort of expectations of how our archive will be used. On the digital interface, archives have to be recalibrated to these new cultural and political values fostered by the digital condition. So it's no longer discovery through archival perusal, but rather instant retrieval of items from vast databases that archives have to prepare for. So looking beyond our own specific initiatives, we find that we are doing our work at a critical juncture in media history that affects the very ontology of archives and the parameters of memory. So there is first the democratization of archives is what we've been sort of discussing, and the various endeavors of citizen archive projects reflected in today's panel are good examples of this. Nepal Picture Library, for example, for a number of years now, we have seen ourselves as an archive whose appraisal about valuable documents include, first, the belief that archives should reflect a broad human experience and social life. Second, attention to social movements because they provide distinct perspectives of the public's relation with the state. Third, the recognition that memory keeping requires broad participation and involvement of publics. And fourth, the realization that digital tools need to be harnessed to tackle the changing infrastructures of memory. We have noted that the ability of citizen archives like ours to expand the content and form of the archive is profoundly linked to specific affordances of digital technology, as well as to the cultural logic that makes digital the dominant media and metaphor in the first place. The myths about digital media democratization are of course true to a great extent. We know how much the digital platform depends on our participation and creation of personal trace through clicking, swiping, commenting, emoting, liking, tagging, sharing, trolling, so on. But we also know that the hyperconnectivity in which we and our archive participates cannot be apprehended through old shibboleths of democracy, public sphere, and authoritarianism. I may appear to have veered from quite far from the question of narrativity that Samira set us off on. The reason I have been foregrounding the digital in our work is because the task of breaking archival silences today may involve both the narrative building strategy and an anti-narrative strategy, both of which correspond to the challenges archives are facing in the new ecology of information. I think I'm going to stop there because it's going to go on for a few more minutes if I continue.
Thank you so much, Devas, for this. I think there's been such an amazing range of provocations there, and I hope that we're able to sort of bring them up in the discussion, also with the other speakers as well. Our next speaker is Sophia Balagamwala. Welcome, Sophia, and I invite you to make your presentation.
Hello, Sneha. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, Sneha. I'm so honored to be part of a panel with practitioners whose projects and efforts I deeply admire. And thank you so much, Samira, for all your guidance. I'll begin with some information about the Citizens Archive, or CAP, as we refer to it, and my place and work with CAP. So the Citizens Archive is a nonprofit I've worked with for over the past 10 years. It was founded in 2007 by a group of individuals across different disciplines with the initial aim to collect stories of the partition generation before they were lost forever. So the first stories being collected are those of the partition generation who migrates from India to Pakistan in and around 1947. their journeys, the things that they left behind, the early days of Pakistan, the first refugee camp set up, the first government offices, and how they started these new lives in this new country. And then later on, we expand to collecting many other stories, many other narratives, and I'll probably come back to these a little later, what kinds of stories are collected, why and how. So what does CAP do? It collects oral histories. This is our founders over here. So we collect oral histories, we digitize images, memorabilia, photographs, even publications. And then what we do is curation, which refers to the archival process, but then also the research, design, and design of programming of permanent and temporary exhibitions. And then where I come in is dissemination. So I've worked with CAP since 2011 in the capacity of research, curation, and educational programming. And initially we have done a series of kiosks, tiny pop-up museums in different places. These are a few of them. This is a later project actually that is quite amazing that I'm not a part of, but I'm excited to share. And then our sort of largest project has been our first permanent museum project. And this is something we started working on in 2016. So it's called the National History Museum. And this is a project between CAP, a nonprofit, and the government of Punjab. So it's a nonprofit and state relationship, so you can understand the kinds of stakeholders that are involved. So the museum is in the Greater Iqbal Park in Lahore, and it is steps away from the Minar-e-Pakistan, which is a monument of huge historical significance and the site where the Pakistan resolution was passed. I should have made you do this. Okay, but we're fine. We'll come back here. Okay, I'm going to stop here. So the artist Fred Wilson and Samira, I've also kind of taken your questions and gone off somewhere. So hopefully you can bring me back in the Q&A. The artist Fred Wilson says, I'm interested in the museum because it's a place where no one expects to be misled. Whatever they give you, you believe. And I'm using this as sort of a starting thinking point because for the most part, the public perception is that you go into museums expecting fact or expecting a truth. Whereas the aims of museums, although some of them are noble and good. So for example, a lot of national museums aim to tell the history of a country, build community, be a space for visitors. But it's important to be very critical of these spaces. I think even if we are working in them, I think we have to be very careful about what can happen and what is going on, because neither the archive nor the museum are neutral spaces. Museums have never been egalitarian projects. As a visitor, you're presented with certain values and certain knowledge in accordance with specific hierarchies and politics. And in fact, museums have in the past in regimes been dangerous and misleading places filled with propaganda and have been used to reinforce agendas of nation building projects and very problematic ideologies, because stories can be exaggerated and stories can be excluded. And these are two things that happen very much so in museum projects, but then also in archives. So my colleague Alia Tayyebi, who heads the oral history project at CAP, she puts this in a very poetic way, that an archive can be a window into possible pasts being plural. And I was thinking about this in terms of being a very powerful provocation, because I'm thinking about the possible histories. So then I'm thinking about multiplicities, diversities, everything is sort of in the plural. And so I'm thinking of a plurality of things that can happen. So I'm questioning if systems of collecting and narrative building and framing can create histories, or can they mask histories, or can they disrupt them? And this is my question for both the archive, but then also the museum, because a lot of our archive in this work that I'm discussing exists within the museum context. So the writer Amandeep Sandhu has said, there is no such thing as nonfiction because nothing is objective. Reality is mediated through you as per your culture. And I think this is very important for practitioners and creators, for us to acknowledge the power that we hold in these spaces, and then the knowledge that we collect, but then also the knowledge that we select and the knowledge that we impart. What initially drew me to archives, and specifically to oral histories, and oral histories are, in case I haven't been clear enough, sort of at the heart of CAP's project, was the ability to rupture a single linear historical narrative. So in one way, multiple voices and oral histories have the power to disrupt this narrative. And so stories that don't make it to the dominant state-approved, state-issued textbooks narrative, or those histories that have been reduced to, say, maybe a small paragraph, and this could be the histories of women in a freedom movement, or this could be something like the history of East Pakistan and Bangladesh in our larger Pakistani history. These are certain histories that we, for instance, have taken on at CAP, amongst many more, but I'm just giving the example of these two. And I'm sharing with you one attempt. And I say an attempt because I'm acknowledging that we have a lot of work to do and our work is not done, and this is in process. So in 2011, 2011 marked the 40th anniversary of the 1971 war and the creation of Bangladesh. And CAP, in conjunction with the Vasant Artists Collective, created an exhibition that chronicled the period from the birth of Pakistan to the birth of Bangladesh with an interactive timeline including videos, photos, objects, oral histories, and archival material. Our archive was not enough to tell this story, and so we collaborated, and this is where collaboration comes in, is so important, that we had objects from Dhaka. We had a collaboration with the 1947 archive, to get oral histories from the other side of the border. And apart from that, because our collection of newspaper clippings was not enough, because our press did not publish everything, we shared press clippings from around the world at that time. After that, we conducted our first oral history interview in Bangladesh in 2016, and currently we are conducting an interview project via Zoom with expat members in Canada. And so again, this is a part of our history that has been reduced to paragraphs, that has been glossed upon, that is unclear in so many ways, but through these efforts, we are trying to expand on it. And okay, excuse me. All right, so we are trying our best to sort of keep this process going and not neatly close it off as chapter close, but to keep the conversation and the research and the collaborations going to make this history more inclusive. And more than that, to educate, again, those who come into a museum or those who interact with our dissemination, to also access this history, which is not available in the mainstream literature. When I speak of framing, I speak of a few different things. I speak of chronology, I speak of language, and I speak of design. So where we begin our story and how we construct a timeline within the museum context and within the archive itself, like where do you start, how do you start collecting stories, and how do you share those stories? This questions our relationship with our coloniality, our lack of acknowledgement of certain events, and if the museum once presented, in the words of art historian Kavita Singh, a complete and comprehensive archive of the empire, what kind of archive does this museum, does our archive present now? So this is an important question. Another thing we think about a lot is design. And because, again, we are in the process of public festivals, of school outreach tours, of a museum, we are in the need to communicate and educate. And for information to be received in a certain way, it needs to be communicated in a way that is, to put it very bluntly, attractive. And so what happens when you take content, when you take thousands of stories and you try to make them into content, you try to make them accessible and attractive, you're essentially reducing, it's inevitable that in some ways you reduce people's stories, sometimes very painful memories and stories, into content. So how do you stop people from turning into content? We have an amazing design team who also, it's very easy to get distracted by all these things, but one of the things we all do, every part of the archive keeps doing, is going to oral history interviews and being part of that collection process, so that you are not dehumanizing the content, and then you keep coming back to the fact that these are real individuals, these are their real stories. So this is one of the ways we deal with that. Another thing that we deal with is that a lot of things are missing. So for example, there are missing pictures, there are missing objects. What do we do? How do we tell stories in that way? Within the museum and within exhibitions, we've used virtual reality experiences. We've recreated stories with collected objects and animations. And then again, I mean, I say something and then I talk about how dangerous it is, but there is a danger in this as well. When you go extremely hi-fi with all the special effects, or when you, which is possible with animation, things get very simplified and flattened out. The audio and again, the human voice is so powerful and moving. That is still there, but it is easy with design, with special effects, with these ways of creating narratives, to simplify the narrative and to make the story something else, something lighter than it was, something different than it was. So this is something also that is a risk in this kind of narrative building within the museum.
Sophia, sorry to interrupt. You have about 3 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Language is another big thing. Given our violent association of both the photograph and the caption with coloniality, how can we tell our story without falling into these formats? Is it even possible? Even if we start from the right, following the Urdu script as opposed to the left, even if we use a national language, we are still excluding many, many people. So how do you deal with the problem of language? Sudha Sengupta writes in his paper, The Notional Museum, museums change the stories that we tell about ourselves all the time. So how accessible and how exclusive are our captions, and how easy it is to write or rewrite a history when given the power to create a caption? So then what is the possibility of the archive? How can the archive create these spaces for different histories and bodies of knowledge? This is a portrait of Ustad Abdullah Khan. He is the last musician to play an instrument called the Shehnai, an instrument that dates back to court culture in the style of renowned musician, the late Ustad Bismillah Khan. So the instrument, popular in the courts pre-partition because of the princely state, now finds it difficult to be part of most orchestras, although it still is played at processions and weddings. But he is the last musician to play it in Pakistan. And so because nobody wants to learn it, when he passes, this knowledge, this practice, this sound is going to leave with him. So in the tutelage of his practice, through the sacred Ustad-Shagird relationship between teacher and pupil, a knowledge or a history is passed down. And the archive can preserve his story and it can save his voice, but it can't save his practice. And so with an example such as his, perhaps the possibility is that we learn not just from his story, but from the way that knowledge is passed on, from the way things are remembered, taught, and forgotten. So maybe we are learning not just how stories, not just learning from the stories that we collect, but maybe we are also learning from the act of collection itself. And maybe we are also learning from the archive how to listen. My final note is this. So this is a personal experience. This is the museum site. It's drawn by an unknown laborer on site. It was drawn on a wall. And I did take a picture, but eventually it was also painted over. We talk about memory and inclusion and erasure and oppression. But the thing is that even though we're in the business of saving memories and saving sites, and that sort of a thing, there can still be a kind of erasure that we ourselves are complicit in. And so I just keep this picture around to remind myself of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for that wonderful presentation. And hope to sort of discuss some of the points that you raised in the Q&A. Our last panelist for today is ASM Reza Rahman. I welcome you, Reza, to the panel, and over to you.
Thank you, Sneha. Thank you, Asia Archive, for inviting me for this talk. I'm representing Dik Picture Library from Bangladesh. I'm the curator and general manager here. Just before we start discussing on our archive, I'd like to give a small background on the organization. DRIC started back in 1989 with a specific mandate. If you look at the time, the representation of the country was mostly made by the Western eyes. So some of the photographers thought that it should be changed. So Shahidul Alam, who is the founder of the Picture Library, he created this platform for photographers so that they can tell their own stories, and then the stories the world is getting has an authenticity. So the Picture Library was born with that mandate, and obviously the very first department of the organization was an archive. An archive which started with DRIC's own photographers, but then later on it expanded. It created a platform for the veteran photographers, for the youth to come and join, and so that they can share their work, they can expand their network. So at some point, we actually understood that just creating a platform for photographers is not enough. You have to expand your horizon by educating your people, and you have to be well equipped, to not only to represent, but also to fight all the odds as a media person. So back in '98, we decided to create a photography school. A school which provide education not only the typical photography learning, but also teaching the word I was using, the representation, teaching how they will fight the odds, and also is all the fighting the odds of the society. So they can, by using the visual, they can actually change or contribute to the change of the society. So Pathshala South Asian Media Academy Institute started with that, and at some point this school went quite well, and then a lot of fine photographers were coming out of the school. And at some point, we found that at the same time, we were producing finest photographers, but these finest photographers needed to be showcased. And as you know, that being in the majority world, in an Asian country, is very difficult to get to make your space in the global scenario, because most of the global platform are hosted by the Western world, and they have their own eye. So we decided, rather taking them to the West, we wanted to bring the West to our home, and then of course cater photographers in that platform. So that's how the festival Chobi Mela started in 2000. So that's a nutshell of how culture, education, and media works together within this organization. DRIC itself is a company. We deliberately created this as a company because we didn't want to be a trust, a foundation, or an NGO, so that we have to depend always on other funding sources. Rather, we decided that we would earn our own money, and then we would be very enough independent to decide what we are really want to do. So our mandate for pointing to the odds to the society was very important. And then it was quite easier for us because it was we who were deciding how we're going to take on them. Coming back to Greek again, it's operated by different departments. Like photography archive is the one very first one, as I told you. There is a group of photographers who takes care of the photography part. We also have a very rich research department. I'll talk about that later. We have an audiovisual department which takes on documentaries and others. We have a gallery. We have one of the finest private gallery in Bangladesh, which definitely plays very important role when we showcase our work.
Sorry to interrupt, Reza. I'm wondering if you want to share your screen
I'll,
or at a later point.
I'll do that. I'll do it.
Okay,
I'll
right.
just
Okay,
finishing
yeah,
the interaction.
No,
So this is how actually we started, and then we shared our resources. We try to create co-fighters, and then at some point we actually decided that okay, now it's a time to create your own archive which will tell the history of Bangladesh, which will take which will represent Bangladesh. And of course, I mean, it started in the very beginning of 89, but then later on how we proceeded, I'm going to share you the screen so that it helps me to share, to explain a little bit. Okay, so as I was telling, that it's definitely came up as a with a specific mandate, and then we while we were digging, we had our the pioneer photographer who was the first Bengali Muslim photographer, and he was one of the earliest short story writer in Bangladesh. And that backs to the 20s from with glass plate negatives. So that's where we we can look back to the I mean to the era, so 20s, 30s, 40s. So some of the examples, Mr. Gholam Kashem Daddy, who later on created a camera club, who was one of the center point for our photographers at that time, and when the salon practice was important. And then at the time when he was practicing was mostly on 20s and 30s. And then later on, it's a big gap. There were during the Pakistan era, there were news photographers who were working in the newspaper, a bit of salon, but not very much strong representation of Bangladeshi photography history. And it's mostly actually the liberation war, which finally, I would say, helped to to unite as a photographer of a country. So during the liberation war, a lot of international photographer came in, but the story from within actually were taken by the photographers, the local photographers. There were news photographers like Rashid Talukdar who were documenting from 69 or even earlier. And there were other photographers, not always the photographer from media, but also the amateur photographer who were documenting the war and creating and writing the visual history of Bangladesh. So Rashid Talukdar was one of the veteran photographer who really documented quite extensively. So his work is with us. It's more than 100,000 images, which are still waiting to be, digitized. This is one of the photographer from the from northern side of Bangladesh, Muhammad Shafi. This is a very interesting image. These two women was actually smuggling grenade, and it's just a fantastic story to tell. It's beyond the war, it's beyond the other agonies and atrocities, but it's also the participation of women in the war. And same as this, Saida Khanum, our the most senior, most female photographer who just passed away some time back. So she was also documenting and documenting the liberation war. So it was atrocity, it was the agony. And Hamid Raihan, who is from Kushtia, he was an amateur photographer, and he actually was moving around the border area with his camera, and then crossed the border and stayed there. So he was never appointed by someone, but he was really telling the story, which was very very local, very earthy, and very authentic. So while the professional photographers were documenting the stuff's happening, also people like Hamid Raihan, Aftab Ahmed were also documenting the war from very close. So this is in a way actually a collection which has become the largest collection of Drake's archive. And unfortunately, this is the largest archive of Bangladeshi history. It's supposed to be done by supposed to be done nationally, but we started quite early, and then this is one of the actually most important archive if I compare it with other works. Now, after the liberation war, the photography practice, if we look at our pathfinders, there were many fine photographers who were practicing as a salon photographers, a little bit of storytelling in terms of in longer narratives, but mostly on salon. Amanul Haq was one who was involved in producing photographs for a magazine called Bichinta. He was documenting, was very close to Satyajit Ray, so documenting his work and family. He created a series, very popular series for the news magazine, Bichitra, which is called Amad Desh, and which actually, if you look at this image, women with lilies, and that's a kind of visual images he was actually creating, a beautiful Bangladesh. Bijan Sarkar was one who was actually one of the photographer who started experimenting. So he loved experimenting. So he had some interesting experimentation in dark room, but at the same time, who also had eye on looking things from the other end. So the time when they were practicing, Noazesh Ahmed, who was a botanist actually, but taking photographs. Uh, we had again, sorry, this is a wrong credit, is by Saida Khanum. As I mentioned, the early photographer, women photographer, very surrealistic, very different language she was using at the time when she was taking photograph. And definitely the that salon period was over when there was a change in the language of photography. There were photographers who were telling the story in longer, with longer, collection, longer photographs, working long time. The largest collection what we have in Greek is by Shahidul Alam. So he started mostly documenting the military regime in 80s, and his work was a quite important documentation in the second liberation of Bangladesh, if I say. Shahidul also worked with issues, those at the time when he used worked on the issues was not quite common. Like this is a photograph from one of the project Positive Lives, the HIV/AIDS, the very early days of HIV/AIDS, when it was a taboo to talk about HIV/AIDS. So we had an exhibition called Positive Lives. Shahidul had work, and we displayed here in Bangladesh, even though people didn't talk about it. So these are some of the issues which actually created in a way okay, and awareness, so people started talking about it. It's again an important issue, again another important issue on the migrant labors. As you know, that the Bangladeshi migrants are all over the world, and it's only the money we look at, which is an important contribution to the country, but very few photographers have worked in depth on to look at the lives and experience of the migrant laborers. So this is a very important body of Shahidul's.
Reza, you have about
Yes.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So another important body which we have is on extrajudicial killing. This is called Crossfire, and there are stories also when we showcase the work. The police came and they actually closed down the gallery, but we took them to the High Court, and actually they were backed off, and we finally showed the work in our gallery. So we take a lot of issues which actually not always the issues that are typically the photographers talk about or Bill's story. I'll just like to finish the presentation with a very quick some slides. An interesting project called Mofashal Photography. So we actually linked young photographers from our school to the rural visual journalists, and then started documenting and collecting and researching on the photographer who usually we don't talk about from the small towns. And we surprisingly we found that back in 1936, when Dhaka photographers were nowhere, the photographers were practicing in Khulna. They were in other parts of the city. Along the border, there was strong practice of photography. This is from Rajshahi, from Jeshore, and it was fantastic that we actually showcased their work to our festival. It was a very strong body of work. But last but not least, what I'd like to add that is this project actually gave us a light that the story of Bangladesh, what we see now, is very, very incomplete. So we are continuing the research so that we at some point we can create an anthology of Bangladesh. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank
Yep.
you so much, Reza. And thank you to all of our speakers. I think with this we can start I mean, this is such an exciting panel, and I have so many questions. And I invite our audiences to actually post questions or comments, using the Q&A feature. And while they're doing this, I think maybe I'd like to start off. I mean, one of the things that's sort of evident in all of your presentations is sort of public engagement, the notion of collaboration, of participation. I mean, it seems to be sort of inviting people, into the archive, or sort of taking the archive out, in a sense, seems to be sort of an important aspect of the work that all of you are doing. And this does sort of course, it does disrupt a very sort of hegemonic idea of how we think about, knowledge being produced, knowledge being disseminated, which, especially when we think about it coming from an archive, it's usually like thought of as a one-way traffic. you know. So I wanted to ask though, would you be able to share or recall any interesting encounters, interesting anecdotes or instances when, say, through these public engagements, through sort of interventions of peoples, how sort of maybe a particular, a document or how something changed about, say, a particular document, or how it sort of added a very different kind of charge to the archive. I sort of invite all of you to sort of share maybe something. Any of you, please.
Well, not exactly to respond to this, but I would like to add an interesting scenario. The way we started actually was not only collecting images. That was only merely a part of the initiative. It was important that we create awareness on our photographers, train them, equip them. Copyright was nowhere in Bangladesh. I mean, the publication, the newspaper were using materials just like, is their own property. So if you look back 20 years back or 30 years back, the newspaper of Bangladesh, you won't find any name under the photographer. If you go through and compare it now, you'll find it's changing. You'll find the name of the photographer, and that's an important contribution, I would say, rather the archive, the school. I mean, it's a learning through that. Actually, the awareness among the photographer in the country scenario is actually it's an important contribution, and apart from that, it's also about the photographer's own right. Even say just few days back, we saw newspapers, countrywide newspaper, were stealing our photos without even creating putting any credit, because that was of prime ministers. So and people started talking about it. So it's important that while we collect and create platform for the photographer and create an archive, at the same time, it's also important that the photographers are also get their right, they get paid, and they get their recognition. So this is an interesting changes, I would say, I have seen in the last 20 years. Just one small example, the change in the putting credit in the newspaper.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Divas, Sophia, would you?
Sophia, you want to go first?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, Sneha, thinking back to the projects we've done, the two projects that I was particularly involved with, which were the Dalit Quest for Dignity and the Feminist Memory Project. I think one of the realization during that project has been, like we go in as archivists, to collect, but we keep encountering how, the different levels or types of documentation and archiving that happen in like many different scales, even prior to our arrival. And I think one of the sort of realization that happened, especially during the Feminist Memory Project, was how much of that archiving, personal archives or institutional archives, were being kept for reasons that we hadn't anticipated. For example, we go in thinking about how to questions of representation, which we have discussed here, or strategies of representation that that an archive should be doing, so forth. But we realized how much of actually the people's everyday kind of engagement with the archive and archiving had to do with actually not so much with how photos, for instance, represent, but how photos become sort of an index of sort of being present, and I think that really has informed the way that we've started thinking about what the archive does. And I think in our own language also, we've veered away slightly from representation to other ways of sort of signifying and giving form to the archive. I can pull examples of this perhaps, but I don't want to take more time.
Thanks, Siva. Sophia?
I think I'm thinking of oral histories that maybe like were a turning point. And I think, I mean, almost every single oral history has been like, has, you know, touched me in some way. But I think when we've done collaborations, that has been extremely just formative in terms of thinking of the way we saw one event. So collaborations with the 1947 archive or with the Partition Museum, or going to Bangladesh and conducting the oral history interviews there. I think just having, hearing an account of the same thing has just, you know, been extremely powerful and just made me rethink a lot of things and very transformative in how we were working and thinking about our work.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to circle back to something that Divas mentioned about the photograph and how sort of one may want to think about it, not just, you know, on representational terms, but the photograph is standing for something else. And, you know, because one of the things that is striking about, you know, the three sort of projects and archives where you all are working is the place of the photograph. And, you know, it does seem to sort of hold central place to a large extent in all of your work. And so, and one of the things that is striking today when we're looking at sort of the cropping up of new archives in various parts of the region today, many of these are also photo archives. You know, many of these actually sort of predominantly, at least the core of their collections, do seem to be photo archives. So, I mean, I just wanted to get your sense also. I mean, what in your opinion, what is it that a photograph is able to do, in a sense, in a way that perhaps other documents are not able to do, or just getting sort of your thoughts on the photograph as a document. I mean, yeah, any of you, please.
Should I begin? So I'm thinking about F.E. Chaudhry's archive that we have at CAP, and he has documented a lot of the refugee journeys. So the trains, and then also post-partition, the setting up of refugee camps. And I guess one of the things is, well, it's a huge archive and very telling, informative photographs, but also the fact that the photographer is there, the photographer is present, is part of the situation, and then thinking about how this photographer is viewing, is framing, how he's participating or not participating. So I think, and then his history as part of that entire process. I think that's a big part of it. And I think what's very interesting with Drick, it seems as though the categorization is so much by photographers, which is very, very interesting because we have a few, but the Drick library seems to have a very expansive categorization of photographers.
Just to add to that, of course it's important to photography as a content of archive, but also, I mean, oral history is also similarly important. Recently we also thought about archiving multimedia stories done by the contemporary visual producers. So we have countrywide, we have visual journalists. We call them, we have a network actually, it's called Rural Visual Journalist Network. And they produce local stories using very minimalistic equipment like iPod Touch or mobile phone. And then they edit there, they make a script, and they create the story, and then they send it to us. We have a platform called breaknews.com, which actually hosts them. So it's an archive of multimedia story, more than 1,000 stories. These are the stories which are coming from the very, remote places, from the very rude, very local, the story which usually you don't get to hear. So the new media is also coming up in our, archiving collection.
Should I answer?
Please.
I think, in my sense, Sneha, I think there are a bunch of things that are playing out in terms of why the new sort of crops of archives tend to focus on photographs. One, I think, one of the most important ones, perhaps, has to do with how photography has become, in a way, the primary sort of mode of documentation, just popularly available. The sort of like the new technologies that have given these affordances that, and you see this everywhere, I think the main way that people record today is through photographs. So I think in the last 20 years, there has been a kind of an attention on photography that has to do, I think, beyond sort of the specific archival initiatives that have emerged, but rather to do with the sort of the media culture in which these archives are emerging. That number one. And I think, secondly, also, when you think about photographs, it's actually one of the oldest formats that have been around that haven't actually gained or garnered enough archival attention. And I think it wasn't until like the 1980s when archivists seriously began to think about what it means to, how to go about actually archiving and cataloging and creating sort of guidelines for preserving photographs. So it's started very late, even though photography is something that, as a sort of a format that has been around as long, in fact, as far back as the first National Archives started in the 1820s, 30s. So in fact, the journey of the sort of the history of technology and the history of archives are kind of very closely tied, but it has constantly kind of slipped away. So I think it's also because of that, when sort of the possibility of expanding formats for the archive started happening in the 70s and 80s, photographs obviously had to be the prime one that had to gain attention. Yeah, I mean, I think there are other reasons too that we can sort of sit and think about it more.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There are lots and lots of questions in the Q&A. So I'm actually going to read out a couple of them, and then I think maybe whoever feels like sort of taking up some of these questions. Is there any, while we're documenting history, how is Asia in terms of new media archives? Is there any archive focusing on new media arts? Or, well, I mean, or perhaps in this context, I mean, how is the question of new media tackled by, say, any of the archives that you're working with? I think Diva spoke already to the question of digital media to some extent. But if anybody would like to take this on, new media archives.
So what formats would that be? With video or?
Any of these, I suppose. Yeah, video, digital, sort of. I mean,
Well, I can just add further to clarify the reason why we actually stepped in the video format.
Yeah.
Is actually not the format which we picked. It's the storytelling. That's what we thought that we are strong, or our photographers are stronger. And these are the people who could document quite well with the moving image. So that's how actually we stepped in. It's not because we were using new media or audiovisual material. It's other way. It's rather for sharing their stories with the medium. Just
it is not the format that the format that determined, in a sense. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure,
right.
Sure. Absolutely. There is a question here, which I think can be sort of interesting. It says, with digitization occupying a key part of the changing landscape of the archive. Oh, sorry. Let me come back to that. There's a question before that I wanted to read. Do the organizations that you all work with have advocacy components that work with or push government authorities in terms of either school education, from curriculum to textbook publications, using your photography and your oral history archives? Or have there been similar initiatives that you've undertaken? I understand that working with government officers in terms of addressing historical narratives is difficult, but if you have engaged in this, what sort of tactics or perhaps subversive measures have you used? And I think, I think all of you did touch upon this, sort of what are the, levels of negotiation with the state that one, I mean, to some extent, the reason why citizens archives crop up is because of, either the failure of the state to sort of document all of these things, the state apathy, or perhaps even very partisan narratives of the state, which then leave out a whole lot. But in terms of your experience, what has your experience been sort of engaging? And I think, Sophia, maybe we can start off with you, because you did sort of elaborate on how a citizens archive deals with a national museum, and perhaps even becomes part of it, if I understand correctly. Maybe we could start off with you.
So, well, specifically to schools as well, and again, as a nonprofit, the funding comes in for certain things and everyone has to survive. So we've had a program called the School Outreach Tours, which goes in and out of session. And what that entailed was that it took a number of educationalists came on board and worked with the design team, the archivists, your history project, to create a curriculum that was more inclusive, that didn't completely gloss over certain important parts of the history, that focused on marginalized communities, that focused on the roles of women in the country and in particular movements. And this took the form of a written educational curriculum, but then also we have a great video department most of the time, and so animated films were created based on some of the oral histories, and it was sort of a very holistic sort of a curriculum that was then taken to schools, but then also it's still on YouTube actually, and I think everyone has access to our links, I think, but it is on the Citizens Archive YouTube, so you can get a sense of how the history of the nation is being taught outside of the museum context. In some ways, again, you have to have YouTube, access to the internet to access it. But what was really amazing was that when we actually got to go to these government schools and some private schools as well, and actually teach this curriculum, the teachers were really amazing. That is, I guess, outside of the museum. I don't remember the question. I can stop now also.
We can come back to you, and I don't think it was. I think it was very much sort of.
I can add to that to the scenario in Dhaka. I mean, actually, we didn't have to do anything if government could take it over. I mean, that's why we have to do what we're doing. If you look at the art scenario in Bangladesh, the largest biennale, the art biennale, which is the National Art Biennale, in international one, it's the oldest one, I believe, in in Asia. That's the very first biennale. Until couple of last biennale, they didn't have any category like photography, and we had to scream, we had to lobby, we had to speak and use bitter words, and now it's there. If you look at the national art school, the faculty, it doesn't have a department like photography. And finally, we had to create our own school. And then, which is very interesting, is that actually our photography department is affiliated under Dhaka University now, not under the Faculty of Fine Arts. It's under the social science. And now it's a full-fledged graduation. So it's an interesting, push. You scream, you make push, and you make some choral. If it doesn't work, do it by yourself. So that's what we did, and now it's at some point it's coming up as a collaboration. It's still a long way to go, but I would say it's a sweet story.
Thanks for that, Reza. Devas, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, Nepal Picture Library itself doesn't have advocacy sort of orientation, but having said that, the way we work, we do have a very extensive and broad, strong sort of collaborative networks, and we mobilize our networks for a lot of the research we do, the exhibitions, and so in terms of lobbying the state or sort of the curricular developments that was suggested in the question, I mean, Saturday is here, who's sort of has collaborated with us in developing curricular programs, taking material to classrooms, so forth. And also, apart from the curricular and educational sort of outreach programs that are always adjacent to the archival projects we do, I've also noticed how, like in a small country like Nepal, actually the state is not very far away from us. Actually in terms of the personnels, there are a lot of overlaps that happens, and especially in the Feminist Memory Project, for example, a lot of the drives we were doing, people we were actually sort of seeking help from, were themselves involved in certain types of lobbying with the state. For example, one that had come up was the creation of a women's museum, which our project kind of became in a way attached to those kind of lobbies as well. I mean, nothing came out of it. Maybe it's still going on, but like because of the overlap of personnels, relations, that sort of the networks in which we operate, the state isn't very sort of, as much as we like to pretend, there's a lot of overlap that happens.
Yeah, it isn't necessarily so far away and such a sort of a top-down perhaps structure as we sort of imagine. There's a question here, a comment and a question. Thank you all for the wonderful insights into archiving as a discipline and its significance. My question would be, what are some strategies that small self-funded collectives can employ to make the process of archiving more sustainable? Any advice from you?
And I can share our experience. I mean, the way we work is a photo bank. I mean, I would rather say. So it's an archive which works as a photo bank. That means the photographer, they keep it in the bank, and when someone uses it, they pay for it. And by doing that, actually, the archive sustains and also the photographer sustains. The phenomenon, the earlier practice of any photograph belongs to anyone. So that actually is changing. So one important area actually is you have to be sustainable. Otherwise, you can't. And archiving is expensive. It's every minute. It's money. So to do that, you have to create a way so that you can channel some sources, some income, and then you can do what you really wanted to do. So this one design, what we practice is actually catering the photographer's content to local and international platform or international market is one how we actually do it.
Thank you, Reza. Actually, connected to this, maybe I'm actually going to rope in another question over here, because as a way of sort of also dealing with this question of the amount of resources it takes to sort of manage and sustain an archive. And there is a question here from Neilton Clark, who says, many thanks for your presentations. With digitization occupying a key part of the changing landscape of the archive, the question is about the maintenance and safekeeping of the analog and hard copy realm. Does the latter assume an increasingly low priority, I suppose the analog or the hard copy? Does it assume an increasingly lower priority given that it is now only one side of the coin, so to speak, What about practical demands like space and storage requirements, adequacy of conditions, funding, and resources for hard copy materials in your respective locales? So I suppose it's also a question of our digital archives, because they may seem like, you need lesser space, because they seem like they're cost effective or comparatively sort of also cost effective, et cetera, et cetera. Does it seem like, I mean, what happens to the physical material? Would any of you like to take this up?
In our case, we actually do it parallelly. I mean, until and unless we are done with digitization, we can't move our extension. But of course, I mean, we have a professional archiving system. So when I say professional, is not the 100% requirement that we can actually provide. But of course, we control the temperature, we control the air, and we have a specific place, and the system of handling is something that we at the moment we are happy. Of course, there are a lot of things to do, but as I mentioned a few minutes back, it is expensive. It is expensive. Every minute you spend to look after your archive actually eating up a lot of a lot of your resources. Now, until and unless you're prepared for that, or a design, you create a design, is difficult to sustain. So so we have tested a lot over the years, and at some point we we created a design which still we're in the market. So I hope that that should work, but I should warn that you have to have a really a lot of resources if you really want to take care of your physical archive. The digital part is quite easier. Once it is done and it's all taken care of, metadata, then it's the space what you actually and a little bit of management. But physical one takes much more than that.
Divas, would you like to come in?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the sustainable way to go is digital. I mean, we don't have the capacity and the means and the resources to hold physical photographs. I mean, going digital is dramatically cheaper, obviously. I don't know was that the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, and there were two questions, and this was one, but I think the other was also about what are some strategies for sort of self-funded sort of initiatives to sustain themselves. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, what we've been doing is the maintaining part, because we are mainly digital, I think the costs are way cheaper. I think what we have to deal with is certain sort of entropies of the digital medium. And I think that, what I tried to lay out earlier about how the archive in the digital medium functions, I think I don't think we have necessarily thought about it or necessarily grappled what it entails. So I guess the concerns are more of that nature, but how we've been sort of staying afloat so far is because the interest is in creating archives. We design projects that help us sort of build archives, and so the funding comes for the projects, but we use that time and the resources and the money to essentially build our digital collections. And I think with Sneha and Samir, I've spoken before as well about how, like, I think archives working in the art space, tapping into sort of the infrastructures of art, that has really helped us as well in terms of sustaining and continuing our work. And I think so. Essentially, I think one has to be clever about how we sort of tap into available resources. We've tried all kind of tacks to basically enable ourselves to continue doing digital archiving work.
Yeah. Sophia, would you like to come in?
Yes, sure. So similar to Divas, we do not have the capacity to house, we have for very few people, but the type of environmental temperature requirements required to handle photographs and objects is just something we do not have. In fact, even the digital part of it, the oral histories, the photographs, the digitization, even that is so expensive and grants come and go, and often grants depend on meeting certain objectives.
Yeah.
So it is sometimes tough when you have a project that doesn't meet those objectives, to sustain a project, or there's so many sort of shelved projects that you have, and whenever a grant arises that fits that sort of bill, you try and use it to build the archive based on that project. But very often there's not a project that's interested in that kind of an archive. So we wait, and some people are generous, and in our particular archive, I guess the founding members also sort of spearheaded a lot of projects of their own, so it was lucky like that. But sustainability is a huge issue. The other thing is, in terms of but definitely digital is cheaper, but it's still very, very expensive, because equipment is expensive, backups are expensive, the kinds of scanners and everything you need, all these things are very, very expensive. And then also, so what we do is, we either bring the stuff, scan, photograph it, take it back, or we go to a site and do it there at libraries or certain people's collections. But even that, I mean, you have to be like, you need, some things are so, initially, I guess we used simpler things, and now we have like this fancy thing that scans from the top. I don't even know what it's called, but we did, for those who are starting out, we did start with just like one camera, some things on phone cameras. And in terms of sustaining a smaller archive, there are a lot of resources online. So for instance, the 1947 archive project has this citizen historian program, and that is sort of one way in which you yourself can learn how to take an oral history of someone. We created this set once of interviewing your own grandparents. There's many archives that have this. Ishita Shah from Curating from Culture, she has so many incredible resources. And one thing I've realized is, even though way back in the beginning, some of the oral historians in the team were trained by the British Library, and they have gone on different trainings here and there. But then what happens is that you come back home and you realize that your conditions or your goals, or the kind of archive and space that you want to create, or just the nature of your work, the nature of the city or the space that you're in. I mean, you really have to localize all these methods to suit it, right? Our methods are not going to be the same as anywhere else, because getting around this city or another city in Pakistan is very different. So I think what we realized is, we need to study everything, and there's so many resources out there, big models, small models, very avant-garde models also, which you can keep looking at to question, what you're doing. But eventually, what I think is best is if you sort of look at your conditions and you localize the process to meet your group's needs and the needs of the archive that needs to be collected.
We should, I just wanted, can I add something, Sneha?
Please.
Yeah, I think it's also good to remember that the digital medium is actually very tolerant of, the kind of images that circulate in the digital platform. And, Hito Style has this article called In Defense of Bad Images or Poor Images. And I think that's useful, to take as an inspiration, that actually that, we are very tolerant. We're very used to very low quality, low resolution images as well. And so, which is in effect for archival project, it means that you do not actually, we use, as Sophia was pointing out, I think the equipments, the cost for, even for digital archiving is quite expensive, but you can also go quite low key, you can start with, pretty basic available equipments. I think the internet itself, because I guess it's a benefit that the internet itself is based on an archival and database model. So much of our life actually, because it happens on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they're all actually based on this database archival structure. They support sort of archive building projects in ways that weren't available even 15 years ago. So I think, those are, I think those are initiatives that should happen, as I think it brings certain recognitions, empowerments that can be achieved through those means as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm aware of time, but I also know that there are so many questions that are there. But I'm given sort of time, I suppose what we can do is we can send sort of the contact of sort of the people and sort of the questions as well to the speakers, and maybe you can respond to them sort of over email or something like that. But we won't be able to take any more questions today. So I'm very sorry about that, but I thank you all. I thank our speakers. This has been such a sort of a fantastic and thought-provoking discussion. I feel like we barely touched upon sort of many of the ideas that have come through in all of your presentations. And I want to thank our audiences as well for staying with us. Before we end, I would like to share that we have one more iteration of the Inter-Archives conversations as part of the Mobile Library Nepal, which will be held early next year. So do stay tuned for that. I also want to thank the AAA and Mobile Library teams for their support, Susanna, Sharare, Rebecca, and really a huge thanks to Samira, who was responsible for putting this program together. And thank you all for attending. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Sneha.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Neha.
Thank you.